you very much for having me. It is really, really lovely to see you. I will try to speak up, but seriously, you can pick up your chair and come closer should you need to. So, and I'm talking about strong technical voices, so I will attempt to be a strong technical voice, but there you go. And how to be heard. That's really ironic now I think about it. Okay, cool. So, yeah, that was going to be the problem. Okay. Bear with me while I figure out how to do slide advance. We are having a few technical. It was working before. Why is it not working now? All right, cool. So this is me. So at my age, you've had more than 8 years of commercial working experience, but you don't want to hear about all of it. I started off my life as a physicist. I have 3 degrees in physics, so that was an insanely long time spent in academia. And I left at about the time when a lot of my peers from MIT were going into Wall Street. And about 2 years after I left, they were all going into Google. So there you go, that dates me. I went from my quantitative research, not quite building quantum computers, but that actually was what my postdoc was in. So I thought that was extremely funny, that question. So I was building experimental quantum computers in my postdoc at Los Alamos National Lab. So the Oppenheimer movie was a lot of fun for me. And I went into bespoke software development and then rode the wave of data, the combination of data, a really good understanding of mathematics, and knowing how to do software development. So it's still quite an unusual skill set, bizarrely enough, because a lot of folk in data didn't come from a software side, and a lot of software engineers are now learning about how to use data-driven products, but it isn't actually what you're taught when you learn application software. So I spent the last 8 years very, very happily building AI-powered products, and I do use that term very, very broadly. If I'd been talking to you while I was working at SEG, we would have called it machine learning, but I've just bowed to peer pressure of that's a marketing term now, and it's a marketing term that covers everything from what I would have called robotic process automation to large language models. I had an absolutely fabulous time, and we launched 8 AI-based products into market, which is still super unusual in Australia. So they're commercially used by millions of people around the world. And if you think I'm quite proud of that, I am. It's really, really hard to do, and we had a lot of fun. What I do at the moment is really driven by the second part of what it says here, that I'm really, really motivated by people understanding AI better. So like many of you, perhaps, if you're trained in science and mathematics, you're bang up against the frustrating edge of people who are really smart and they're really commercially driven and they'll learn pretty much anything else. But when it comes to technology and math, they go, oh, that's technology. I'm not technical. I'm like, no, you're not technical perhaps, but you're smart and you could learn and you need to learn. And particularly, I think, for younger people in the world today, being AI literate, being statistically and data literate is really important, because otherwise you will get the wool pulled over your eyes. So I think it's really important that everybody puts down that belief that they can't understand it and really tries to lean in and understand it. And important that those of us who have the luck to have stayed in that, being in that field when it was really arriving, put some of our time into communicating and helping other people realize that they can absolutely understand it. If you are interested in what I chat about tonight, I do write a Substack, a Substack, that's a thing, right? A Substack newsletter when I chat about this type of thing. So I'm trying not to go down too many rabbit holes because I have been told I've got a very short amount of time, and I love answering questions, so I want to leave time for questions. But one of the most amusing things if you work in the field that I work in at the moment is everyone going, oh, AI, got to get that new tech. And you're like, not new at all, in fact, older than everyone in this room. I really like the story of the genesis of AI as a term. Effectively, there was a guy who had coined cybernetics, and there was another academic who really didn't like him, who said, I don't want it to be called cybernetics because then it will be associated with X person. So I'm going to call it AI, and now it's associated with him. And I believe it was in 1956, the first academic conference where that term was really coined, but really in a war of words between, I don't want to call it cybernetics because if it's cybernetics, it's not mine. So it's kind of funny. And I think the reason I always mention it when I'm talking is because I think that it's causing a lot of people at the moment who are peripherally associated with it to say, wow, if we can do this much in 18 months, just imagine what the next 5 years will look like. Now, I do think the next 5 years are going to look really interesting, but it's not because we achieved ChatGPT 4 level tech in 1.5 years. We absolutely didn't. Large language models are built on about 30 years of 3 distinct academic disciplines. Massive kudos to the companies that have commercialized it and put an enormous amount of engineering into a user interface that millions of people have at least dabbled with. But it's really distortive, and a lot of investors are struggling with this problem if you let it sink into your head that this is how much we've advanced in 18 months. So I think that's always a really important point to point out. So I'm a skeptic because I'm a scientist, and by which I mean I always want to say it might work, but I want to see if it really does, and I always tend to try to prove that it doesn't, and then get really excited if I can't prove that it doesn't work, if that makes sense. I've been relatively bearish, is the right term, isn't it, if you're an investor? Yeah, on generative AI, because I know how it's built, and I see a lot of people conflating large language models and the neat, though somewhat limited things they can do, search, and the really neat, but let's face it, also somewhat limited things that they can do, and a number of other types of AI. And it's very easy to start to conflate those in conversation. And then you go, hang on, I think you just stacked about 4 different kinds of quite complex, quite buggy, quite difficult to maintain technologies on top of each other there. That's not going to be a cheap thing to build. So it's not that I don't believe that there are some really interesting things you can do with generative AI. I think they're a lot more limited than a lot of people who don't have a close understanding of the tech think they are at the moment. But my challenge from the beginning has been and continues to be, can you do it cost effectively? And that's cost effectively from an economic point of view, and cost effectively, as KB has just really beautifully pointed out to us, from a climactic point of view. So I have a very dear friend who leads the internal AI work at one of the big 4. And I was having dinner with him last time I was up in Sydney, and he sent me an email and he said, because he was thinking about this Neuralink podcast that he couldn't thing. And he said, I looked it up, Perplexity AI, and he sent me the screenshot. And Perplexity had given him a nice answer, and it identified the podcast he'd been talking about. I took the phrase he'd put into Perplexity and I stuck it into Google, and I got exactly the same answer. So I think that we are also at the moment just, even people who work in the stuff day by day, it's so much fun to play with that we're not always being really hard-nosed and commercial about it, because it was a lot cheaper for Google to search me that result back than it was for Perplexity to link up to Google and link up to OpenAI and bring me back a sort of nicely parsed version of a little story about it, but not going to be that many more times I'm going to read those stories before I just go, look, I just want the link. I just want to go to the place where I can listen to the podcast. So this is really hard to see, but generative AI is right up. This was in, I think, November, came out from Gartner, and it was right up on the top of the peak of inflated expectations. Now, remember, if you're not familiar with Gartner, that is not saying that a technology is not useful. It's saying that we as a species, as an investor group, as a bunch of technologists, whatever, have hyped it so much that it's almost inevitably going to fail to be as exciting as we believe it will be. And then people will go, you promised me a rose garden. And many people will say, well, no, I didn't, but you just weren't really listening. This is all over the news at the moment. I have a lot of respect for the investor from Sequoia, because this is an updated version of an article he wrote about a year ago in which he said AI has a $200 billion question. And he updated it to go, oh shit, no, the revenue really doesn't seem to be coming and the investment's still going in. So that gap that he can look at and see between how much we're spending on it and how much it will need to return is widening, which I think is really interesting. And this was out of the AFR quite recently. And I love the phrase, so I'm so glad that I can now actually attribute it, well, not to Paul, but to one of the people he interviews. Generative AI is a fantastic first draft fairy. But it's much harder to put your finger on the next use case that it is. And I find that really interesting, because it has now been around and hugely accessible to a lot of people for a long time. There are use cases beyond first draft fairy, but they require a lot of engineering. A lot of engineering. You are wrapping a lot of glue code and a lot of rules and a lot of exception code and a lot of evaluation around this magic API that you can call. And I was having a conversation with one of the best AI engineers in the country, and it was really interesting. A pattern that he sees emerging is that you can use it as, you might say, a sort of a fuzzy integration point that is much more forgiving of upstream breaking changes than some of the other ways we do data pipelines. But the solution is probably to call it multiple times until the response that you get back meets a bunch of criteria that you've basically set to filter out challenging problems. And if you're calling OpenAI 5 times or 10 times, up to 10 times in every query, you really are starting to crunch through a lot of compute and a lot of power. So I think there's heaps of really interesting questions around this space. But what I wanted to talk about is, why do we constantly get ourselves into these situations where we get extremely highly hyped technologies, and then frustratingly for those of us that work in the space, you then often do get that bit where like everyone goes, oh, no, I invested in that 2 years ago and I didn't get my money. And so you actually go through that space where you're like, for what it's good for, the stuff is really good. But yes, it's expensive. Yes, it takes time. Yes, it's hard to implement. And you do go through that trough of disillusionment where you can't get funding for it and you can't get investment in building it within large companies. And so I'm pondering of why, and I'm not suggesting that me or this talk tonight is going to solve this problem. But I think there's a couple of reasons why we're in such a frenzy at the moment around AI. And it falls into 2 camps, if I'm a little bit cynical. I think there are people really, really close to this who are really deeply technically skilled. Some of them are super young, so they haven't been through boom bust cycles before. Some of them not. They're very, very deeply skilled. They're much more aficionados of this stuff than I am, but they do have a profit motive. So I think that's, because I'm about to say that one of the challenges we have is that we don't have strong enough technical voices close to the hearts of these companies, and you would all refute that. You'd say, what about Jeffrey Hinton? What about all these people? I think there are some folk who are so financially motivated and so much live inside this bubble that it's really challenging for them to be that strong technical voice because of the companies they work within. So that's one reason why I think we get overhyping, is that there is just so much money tied up with this stuff. And we've seen a lot of the investors who lost a lot of money in Bitcoin and all of the sort of the Ethereum and blockchain, etc., take their money across to generative AI. So I believe it's a really interesting technology. I believe part of the reason it's as hyped as it is today is folk need another place to put their money, and they need another place to gain back that credibility. But the other reason, and the point of the second half of my talk, is it's really confusing. So like I said, a lot of smart people in Australia who are commercially savvy, who lead companies, who've done a lot of amazing stuff, they just are not comfortable having conversations about technology and engineering. And that leads to a lot of FUD, fear, uncertainty, and doubt. It leads to companies not making great decisions about this stuff because they're not comfortable and they don't have strong voices at the board table and the executive table who can confidently say, these are the upsides, these are the downsides, let's make risk-based decisions with our eyes open. So I would exhort all of you to become strong technical voices because we lack them, and I think it slows down the Australian economy. So my quick cheats guide to how do you build a strong voice. I mean, obviously not, right? But I'll give you a few of the things that I've found really, really useful and helpful. I led a team of 140 brilliant machine learning and AI engineers and data engineers and product managers and everything at Xero. And I spent a lot of time coaching them on how to present their point of view strongly. Because if you build AI products today, it is very difficult to be a non-technical AI product manager. And a lot of them drive the AI engineers absolutely nuts. And so you really need to make sure you have strong dialogues going on in those conversations. So some of these are things that have worked for me, and some of them are things that that have worked for me and certainly for other people, because I've coached a lot of people in how to bring their voice into that table, right? Because there's nothing more frustrating than being super smart, working really hard, having a really good understanding of what you do, and constantly see your opinions not be taken into account. There could be so many reasons for that. I'm not going to be able to diagnose all of them because there's as many as there are people in this room times 10. But these suggestions are some of the patterns that I've seen really strong technical people fall over on, and so I'll share them with you in that spirit, if that makes sense. First one, and I'll also put aside, it might not be for you, right? You might be, as are many excellent engineering folk I know, not in the slightest bit interested in that. And that is fine. I am not suggesting that you should be. I'm not suggesting that that is the necessary calling for every single person who's ever lifted their fingers off the keyboard. But the people I guess I am trying to speak to is the people who want to be listened to and can't figure out or are a little frustrated about why they're not, right? So if you want to not get into this realm of influencing, fine, that's a perfectly reasonable decision. But if you want to, this is some of the, sort of perhaps some of the bridges to get there. The first one I'd say is don't look over the fact that you have to be excellent at what you do. So don't spend if you want to become influential, don't spend your entire life buried in getting better at what you do technically, because at some point you will be yak shaving. But you genuinely do need to be excellent at what you do. And the reason I stress that is I've had a lot of much younger people say to me, I really want to get into strategy. I'm like, I really think you should learn how to do what it is you do first. And then you should get into strategy. Because honestly, ChatGPT will replace you as a strategist if you think that strategy is writing PowerPoint, because it isn't. So first, be really, really excellent at what you do so that folk have a reason to want to listen to your voice. I think this is another one where I've just seen so many people trip up. So please don't be offended if you wouldn't trip up over this, but a lot of people do. You have to be fascinated by complete solutions. If you want a place at a leadership table and at a decision-making table about where the investment is going and how your company's products will be developed, you have to care about the whole solution. And it's easy, particularly as a really deeply technical person, to get particularly excited about your bit, to be particularly interested in beautiful code, and be like, yeah, but we're not actually a company that develops a coding language. We're a company that sells a product for customers. So I think that one thing I would really recommend to you is find whatever it is the way you can to become really fascinated in complete solutions, so that you're not making the mistake of talking about one really strong vertical part of a complete solution, because a lot of people are just too polite to tell you that that's why they're not listening to you. Weirdly enough, there are a lot of just really, really polite people, and unfortunately their politeness is simply not to tell you. It's a bit of a bummer. It's kind of really related, but I think it's the next step along, and that is understand the business model. So I've had a lot of really, really smart folk working with and for me who are so fascinated with the problem that they're working on as they don't understand, or they haven't chosen to understand the economic business model of whatever they're doing. And it's really hard to be taken seriously by somebody whose job is to make sure the company makes its cash flow if you're overlooking how the company makes money. Okay, that was me being a little flowery with my language. I didn't use ChatGPT, I promise. But what I mean is, we all have vocabulary and jargon. My goodness, you go to any industry and the TLAs abound. We use them as shorthand. We absolutely do, right? And I mean, API, how many of you even think anymore that API is an acronym and a TLA and kind of a little bit difficult for other people to understand? And we don't want to start saying application programming interface every time we say it, because it will take a long time. But I've learned to become extremely conscious of my vocabulary. And if I want a particular type of person to listen to me, or I need them to get on side to sell what I need done, I learn their vocabulary, because it breaks down that level of them shutting up the walls and saying, oh, that's technical. Don't understand technical stuff? Like, that's cool. I'm not talking about technical stuff. I'm talking in the language of marketing. I'm talking in the language of risk. So learn the vocabularies of adjacencies. And you could say, Kendra, that's an awful lot of work. Why can't the adjacency learn my vocabulary? It's like, yeah, but they're not the one who's trying to get heard. So you can only change yourself, right? You can ask people to change, and some of them will, but you can only change yourself. The other one is be a really, really curious student of human nature. A very lovely boss of mine once said to me, Kendra, if the choice is between, malevolence and incompetency, assume incompetency. And his point was, very few people get out of bed and come to work to be a pain in the ass. Very few people are actually genuinely trying to stop you doing a good job. So if you can put down the assumption that, and it took me a while, I'm quite a confrontational person, but if you can put down the assumption that the person you're talking to who's, not getting it, is doing that to annoy you, you can open your curiosity about, well, then why are they doing it? And you will probably find it much easier if you come up with 5 different explanations of why they might be doing this, where you cross out the one that says to piss me off. I think it's a really good way to figure out, oh, I'm missing a piece of this problem here. I'm missing an understanding of why this person is obstructing what I want done. And the final one, if you take nothing else away from it, is speak to be understood, right? if you're talking and someone else is not understanding you, a long time ago I realized that's your problem, not the other person's problem, if your intent is to have impact in the world. So yeah, I will just, there's nothing more I can say about that one. I just say that's, to me, the really, really last important one. And I really hope that those of you who are really strong technically and really great at your craft, but have an interest in having a broader impact, one might say, rather than a deeper impact, will find some of this helpful, and that you'll be the new really strong technical voices that Australia needs. And if I'm super happy to chat and help folk with their thoughts about it, if you're struggling with something, or you go, but Kendra, they don't listen to me. Something I've been doing for a long time, and I'm really passionate about it. So I think that was me. It was excellent. Thank you very much.
All right, thank you. Thank you so much. And we've got time for questions. So, okay. This is more for
the
live
streaming.
stream. So
Yeah.
you just
Right.
ignore me.
What advice for the commercial people who seek to be understood by the technical people?
Yeah, in the realm of AI specifically. Okay, so let me answer that. For the realm of AI specifically, I think it's obvious how it goes outwards. MOOCs are your friend. So I think there are now some extraordinarily well done introductory to MOOC courses, particularly in the space of AI, which is obviously the space I know really well, done by Andrew Ng. So I think taking the time, and I know that sounds a little disheartening to somebody, but they really are built at all levels of on-ramp. And I think the two reasons I'd say that is, one, because I think it really will give you a better understanding of the dimensions of the commerciality of what you might be talking about with a person, because again, back to AI, the commercial model of AI-driven software is very different from application software. So I think it will just open your eyes. You'll be like, oh, shit, right, yeah. And the other thing is it will help, okay, if people know that you've invested that amount of time in learning what they care about, I think that will open their hearts and minds to sort of taking you from there to the next place. So that would probably be my advice. I hope that's helpful.
Any more questions?
While he's running the mic, I'll just say that's one thing I always do, is I keep a list of all the good talks and good papers and really, really entry-level ones, not because I find them useful to learn myself, but because I go, oh, it would take me a very long time to write that. And now that I have it, when I find a CFO or I find a CPO or I find a chief marketing officer who has genuine interest in learning, I'll be like, have I got an article for you? And so I would always stockpile, borrow with pride, put those things in your back pocket. So when you get folk like Paul saying, hey, I want to learn, you have something, a really well-written on-ramp to give them, and you can really help them.
Thanks, Kendra. Lovely talk. Just a question around the sort of hype cycle that you had up there, and sort of generative AI sitting at the top of that.
Yep.
And it is literally one of the only things I seem to constantly hear about on BD pipelines and whatever it might be. I guess, do you think that the level of hype that is in there and the amount of investment that's kind of coming through will potentially speed that through that trough of disillusionment, or do you think it is actually going to properly stall?
Yeah, good question. So I could talk about that all night, and I'll attempt not to. So one, I think it is pretty likely, and nothing's ever a sure bet, so strong opinion, lightly held, but I think it's pretty likely that we are hitting an algorithmic wall, that we've really pushed transformer architecture about as far as it's going to go. We can continue to fiddle with the data, we can continue to fiddle with that, and we will get some stuff out of that. But they're all saturating. You look at the leaderboards boards, it's all saturating now. They've actually said they don't have GPT-5, right? The CTO accidentally said that online one day, and everyone was like, oh, well, there you go. So, and the other thing that's really interesting that isn't widely known is that GPT-4, not 4 Omni, but 4, was in the box and trained when they released their original version to public. That's extraordinary when you find that out. You're like, ooh, wow, okay, we are being given a very, very good marketing solution here. So I think it's really likely that we've pushed the transformer architecture to the edge, and we're not going to get a really big step up. So then you go, can we get an economic return on our investment with the capability close to the capability that we have today? And I think we can get a lot more than we have got, but I do think that it will become, always makes me laugh. One of the board members of the company I was working for at the time when ChatGPT came out, if you're really interested, you can figure out from my timeline who that probably was, sent round a paper saying the cost of software engineering will go to zero. I don't think any software engineer I know who isn't the slightest bit worried about their job. There is so much engineering that we have to wrap around what we have today in terms of generative AI to realize the economic benefit. So I think there's an enormous amount that we will be able to do, but it will take a lot of engineering effort. And my concern is that what I'm frustrated with at the moment, having spent so many years working in traditional AI, and it was like, well, it has to be good enough, right? It can't ever be, if you could just change your user behavior a little bit, I've got an algorithm here that can work really well for you. It's like, no, the algorithm has to fit seamlessly into the user experience. And fair enough. Suddenly the bar is very different. I've heard people saying it's really important that students at university today learn how to prompt AI models really well. Is it? Like, when did it become that now that the models are so good that the humans just need to change the way they talk, and then the models can be really, really useful? So I'm a bit concerned around the economic incentives that are pushing us towards what I see as enshittification of jobs, and people being left with the pieces that are hard to automate, regardless of whether that's actually an interesting role. So that's a very long answer to your question, but I don't know, Kenny?
She gets a credit
Sorry. In the industry I'm in carbon accounting, there's a lot of marketing around the AI embedded in these softwares.
Yep.
I question if it is AI in a lot of software.
Yep.
What do you think are some good questions
Yep.
to ask salespeople to ensure that it is AI and not just like a
Well, yep, that's a
query?
really good question, except for the fact that I'd say doesn't matter. So the word AI, the term AI now means this, right? So let's all just agree that it does. And so those marketing people are not being charlatans, they're not pushing anything. We've just redefined what the term means. It now means everything from screen scraping and robotic process automation to generative AI, for sure. That's one part of my answer. The next part of my answer genuinely is, does it matter? Because one thing I think we're seeing a lot at the moment is .ai. And you're like, cool. Do my users need to know that you did it with AI? Or is that a marketing scheme? I think often, no, the users don't need to know you did it with AI. And in that case, the flavor of AI that it is, as long as it works, maybe it doesn't matter. Then there's the next level of the answer, which is, yeah, sometimes it does. And you really want to know, either because you're paying a huge price premium for it, or because you don't think it's stable yet, and you are in a risk-averse nature, then you can't roll that out. Or, to your point, you are really significantly concerned around the carbon and water impacts of what you're rolling out. Then this is a question I start a lot of my conversations with, what does AI mean to you? Like, genuinely, I would suggest you ask that to the vendor, because when they say, oh, we do this with AI, that's really interesting. Just help me, because it's such a widely used term, and everyone has a slightly different idea of what does AI mean to you. And I think you'll get the answer of how much that marketing person knows. And then I think I would be asking maybe some questions around, is the data that the AI was trained on representative of the population in which I will be using it? And often isn't, if you're using it in Australia, because it's often trained on American data. Who owns the data that I put into the algorithm? I would always be asking that, because your company may or may not be comfortable with using stuff that has been used without license. That's one of the big differentiators between that Adobe is pushing right now, is that they'll only use licensed content in their generative AI models. So it's those types of questions that I'd actually ask. I don't think the technical questions are very useful when you're talking to a salesperson, because realistically it's not their job to know. But I think if you ask questions around it, around how safe it will be for you to use it in your corporate context, you'll learn a lot. And if they don't know, they will come back with a product specialist who can answer your questions better. So I hope that's helpful.
One more question.
You can just ask now.
Oh, okay. Thank you. Yes, look, as an entrepreneur, I'm just wondering how we deal with the sort of exponential matrix of AI releases that are coming out. I think it's currently 12 to 15 a week, and it's just flooding the market. There's crossovers, there's deletions, there's new exponentiations, and it drives you nuts. And the fact is, which mainstream can you hang on to, and look what might hang off the back of that. For example, Anthropic or whomever, they're always coming out with something new, or something else is redundant within the same week that the next one's released. So just wondering if you've got any suggestions as to what to follow.
Yeah, I think it's a really pertinent question and a problem that a lot of people are struggling with. I think it very much is it depends answer. It depends on how critical the use case you're using it for is. It depends on how skilled your engineering team are. I think it's not rocket science. The ones that are least likely to go belly up are Anthropic, OpenAI. It's probably the two I'd stick with at the moment. It's like you look at Gemini, of course. So Google, So I just have a bit of a thing. Yeah, no, you're right. No, Gemini. Yep. They're not going to go belly up, right? Those companies are going to be around for a while. What I'd be more concerned about is, can you hot switch? And if your engineering team are storing their prompts in the code, you can't hot switch because those models are absolutely prompt sensitive. So that's more the questions I'd be asking is, we should build as if we're going to have to switch, unless this is throwaway that we're never going to have to use again. Don't let anybody tell you that the prompts are transferable between models, because they're not. And the other thing I would really recommend if you're building in this space is, and you should put at as much time as you do for everything else, building your evaluation. Because it's ultimately how good your evaluation is that will tell you how fast you can change if you're an Anthropic customer and Anthropic goes offline. I mean, they're not great with their reliability. I have an engineering friend who's working really intensively and uses Anthropic and OpenAI, and the number of times he comes out and goes, gee, OpenAI was having a shitty day today. It's like, it's still just on the edge of usable, that stuff, because they have days where it just starts talking gibberish. Now, is that heavy server load? I don't know, possibly. But it shows you how many people aren't using it commercially, because we don't hear about those brownouts that are happening, but they're happening every couple of weeks. So put as much engineering time into evaluation as you do into everything else you do with generative AI. And if you come across a company, which I did the other day, which my guess would be what they're doing is they have a machine learning engineering team who are building the models, and then they have a data science team who do the QA, which means their engineers are playing with the APIs and going, yep, looks about right. And then when the products don't really work quite well and the edge cases fall over and some of their customers are a bit pissy, they go, oh, data scientists, can you do the QA on the models, please? That is a very application forward way of thinking, and I'm not surprised to see it in emerging companies that haven't done a lot of development with data, but it's doomed to failure. So put your evaluation squarely in the responsibility of the whatever cross-functional team is building your generative AI parts of your solution, and constantly ask them how robust their evaluation suites are and how fast they can rerun it. There's too much evaluation by vibe going on at the moment, and it's going to kill you. So,
just a follow-up question to that. What is the role of the data scientist now on a project like that?
So let me try and give you an answer that steers away from role titles, because that particular role title is really confusing, right? Because if you go back in the day, it was not a role title. It was a team. It was a thing you did. It's kind of like DevOps was never meant to be a person. It was meant to be a practice. So, and I stopped calling people that term some time ago because it was just so confusing as to what it meant. So I think it really depends. If you're a user of, like many of us are through Microsoft, Google, and all that, you don't need anything, right? You just need to use it. And many, many, many Australian companies and many startups should be users of, and they don't need teams, they don't need devs, they don't need anything. I would be surprised if there was more than 3 Australian companies who are builders of who are genuinely training something close to their own foundation model, because it's just so expensive that I don't know any VCs who are investing that kind of capital in Australia. So there's a chunk in the middle who are what I would call builders on. So they're using whoever's API, or they're self-hosting their own models or whatever, and they're fine-tuning, some of them are, but they're not stupid enough, or, as in they don't have big enough, deep enough pockets to go, I think I need to teach it language again. I think I need to teach it grammar. I'm going to go back to the beginning and train again. They're fine-tuning it to their own vocabularies with their own use cases. And there's still teams doing great things with more traditional AI. My suggestion in teams like that is you still need, if it's an important enough part of your product to differentiate, and if it isn't, why are you building it? Because these teams are really expensive and the products are hard to run. I think personally, and if I was when I am building another team, this is what I will do. I want to have people who actually understand the algorithms. So call them what you like. There aren't very many people in Australia, but I want to have some people, not who want to do research, because I always go, I'm not an R&D team. If you want to do pure research, I'm sorry, but you will have to go to the US. But they can read the research papers. They do read the research papers, and they understand enough about how the algorithms function that they know why they go wrong. I don't know what you want to call those people, but I believe you need those people. You absolutely also need, and they're very rare to be in the same package, really good application software engineers. In most cases, you also need, and they're very rarely in the same package, some really good data engineers. Those terms might not be the exact terms, but there are not that many great application software engineers who really intimately understand data flows and can do good data engineering. And I know this because I've crashed these people into each other many times and made them realize that they don't have the same skill set as the other person does until they'll actually respect each other and work together. And then I think it's a really interesting question as to what you do around product management. That's where I think a lot of people who are perhaps not algorithmically deep enough to be really part of the build team can thrive. So folks who perhaps 5-10 years ago would have been working in a data science space were super comfortable with some of the less deeply mathematical algorithms. So they're really familiar with how iteratively you have to build, how there's no right answer, how you have to have workflows that fail gracefully because no model is going to be more than 90% accurate. So what are you going to do the 10% of the time that it's wrong? Because 10% of the time wrong is actually quite bad. I think folk like with that skill set who perhaps don't have a deep enough technical understanding to really be comfortable figuring out which algorithms are appropriate are perhaps really well placed to become kick-ass AI product managers. If you were a product manager today and your background is not in AI, in my opinion, you have an enormous amount of learning to do to become an AI product manager. And like this lovely gentleman here who said, what do I read to know more about it so that I can have the commercial conversations with better vocabulary? If you're a product manager who isn't an AI specialist, go and take 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 AI courses and learn how to build models. Not because you then want to go to your engineering pals and tell them, well, I know how this is done, so I'll just do it for you. Because that really pisses people off, because I've heard that conversation happen on the floor several times. But because you'll get a really good understanding of how non-deterministic this is and the dimensions that you need to accommodate in your thinking if you really think that you want to work in AI. I often say that AI software in general, but AI in particular, is a thing that we're all incredibly lucky to work in, but you only work in it if you love it enough to spend far more of your personal time staying up to date with it than any rational and sane person would. So I think that's true for anyone who wants to work in this space. Work in it eyes open, because it's a 60-hour-a-week commitment to stay current. And I've seen some people who are like, I don't want to have to stay current. but I still want to work in AI. And I'm like, tell me how that works out for you. So I'm not saying it's right, but I'm saying it's the reality of how it is. So I think it's important to kind of just be at peace with it.
Okay. Well, I'll go back to using this thing. I know you want to ask another question, sorry. Can it wait for the pub? Okay. Sure. Okay. Syria is invoking
yeah.
organizer privilege.
Oh yeah, fair enough then. Yeah.
So my question is, like, you mentioned that you have a AI learning resource in this back pocket all the time. Are you by any chance sharing it publicly?
Oh, that's a good question.
So it's not that it's private. It's that it decays really quickly. So shameless plug. Subscribe to my Substack newsletter because that's what I write about. Right. I very rarely write about anything deeply technical. Largely because I think a lot of people do that better. And I think the underserved niche is technically literate people who write for a business audience. And I definitely share a lot of that stuff on LinkedIn because that is the LinkedIn demographic, is people who actually are mostly commercially minded in their business practice. It's not, like I said, it's not that I wouldn't want to share it. It's just that the last time I compiled one was when I was working at Xero, and it would be 18 months out of date by now, and therefore not as useful. But Andrew Ng, brilliant. I begin to wonder a little bit about how much money is starting to push some of his opinions. But in general, he has an incredible commitment to pedagogy, and he is an incredibly great communicator. So I would almost universally recommend pretty much any course that he has done. And there are courses at almost all levels for people to look at. If you're interested in seeing, this is less to answer your question, but people I really find interesting. And I think it's useful to have an antidote, getting late, to the extremely large amount of very positive press you see. Emily Bender is a really, really interesting academic. She's actually a computational linguist. She's been researching in and around this field for a really long time. She's one of the few people who is still an academic and hasn't shifted into one of the highly remunerated positions inside a company. I think she's getting a little bit polemic at the moment, but I think you would in that situation because the other side gets quite polemic too. But she has a lot of depth of knowledge in this space. I find her really, really interesting. Marcus on AI. I can't think what Marcus's surname is. He writes a Substack called Marcus on AI. Now, he really is polemic, but he's really funny. And he just bursts a lot of bubbles. I think it's really, really good to have that both sides of the picture. And then the other one I'd really recommend for folk who are interested in just trying to get what's true and what's hype is I think it's called AI Snake Oil. It's out of HAI. I think it's Arvind and Satyesh. One of them's at Stanford, one of them's at MIT or something. And they do a really good blog, and they're co-authors on a lot of the stuff that comes out of Human AI Interface, HAI from Stanford. And they just do a lot of sort of reality grounding around if you take this argument and go through it, how does that work? They came up with some of the co-authors of the Transparency Index around, hey, we don't want you to stop. We just want you to tell us on these 21 dimensions, how does all your stuff stack up? And guess what? On every single dimension, at least one of the, I think it was 21 people they surveyed could answer it. So it's not like these questions are unanswerable. You're just choosing for your own commercial or whatever reasons not to tell me. So I think they've got some really interesting, constructive conversations about how we, to some of the conversations we were having earlier, how we make sure that the way we use this is going to benefit more people, not less. So those are just some of the people that I find really, really interesting. Doesn't really answer your question, I'm afraid, but yeah, the answer is that's stale and this is more interesting.
We'll definitely share your Substack on the Discord and any other material that you think would be relevant and more up to date, and let us know and we'll distribute that
I'll
around.
find all those people I just mentioned. I'll pass them
that'll be great. Okay, well, round of applause, Dr. Kendra. Thank you so much.